North Field on the island of Tinian in the Marianas, 1,500 miles south of Japan. In the summer of 1945, this was the biggest air base in the world. Here, on August the 5th, the world's first uranium bomb was loaded into a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, after its pilot's mother. Next morning, before dawn, the Enola Gay took off. Its target, Hiroshima. On April the 12th, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, died suddenly. The nation mourned its lost leader. He had brought them from the depths of economic depression 12 years before. Now he had led them to the eve of victory in a world war. 2 months before his death, Roosevelt had been at Yalta in Russia, laying the political foundations of the post-war world. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted to restore democracy to Eastern Europe, particularly Poland. They also asked Stalin to confirm that Russia would join the war against Japan 3 months after the defeat of Germany. In a cheerful atmosphere, the Big Three thought they had reached agreement.
Well, Yalta was really the high point of the relationship between the three men. Victory was in the air. The Germans were in retreat. And so there was a good deal more talk, in addition to the military matters, to the future. Poland again became the most troublesome point. And it's interesting that both Roosevelt and Churchill felt they had an agreement with Stalin.
The problem with Poland, as with all Eastern Europe, was that the Western leaders wanted a freely elected government there. The Soviets wanted a government friendly to Russia. They thought the West understood and accepted this.
Poland, from their point of view, was not going to be an outpost of the West, nor any of the Balkan countries. They thought they'd had various agreements about spheres of influence with Mr. Churchill. They left Greece pretty much in British hands. They could have certain proportional influences in Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and particularly Poland. My impression at Yalta was that the Russians thought we had in substance accepted that demand.
After Yalta, Roosevelt lived for only 2 months. Even by then, he and Churchill had become disillusioned by the interpretations the Russians were putting on what was agreed there.
The very, very tough exchange of telegrams on both sides between Stalin and Roosevelt makes it very plain that Roosevelt, before he died, knew that Stalin was breaking his agreements.
I think it went sour because the military developments strengthened Russia's hands, and that where The Russians had felt it necessary to be considerate of Western opinion. At Yalta, a few months later, they didn't feel any such necessity because the war was going so well for them, and therefore they swept aside some of the engagements they got into. That certainly applied particularly about Poland.
Roosevelt had been seen as a friend by the Russians. His successor, Harry Truman, was an unknown quantity, both to them and to his own advisors.
I left as soon as Roosevelt died, to go back to see Mr. Truman. I wanted to be sure that President Truman understood the position of our relationships, because there'd been so much euphoria in the air about the warm relationships that existed with our gallant allies. And I got home within a week of the time that Roosevelt had died. I found, my first experience with President Truman, I found he was an avid reader. I found he'd read all the telegrams and understood from those messages the difficulties we were going to have.
The arrival of their foreign minister, Molotov, in Washington on April the 23rd gave Truman a chance to prove, as he put it, that he would stand up to the Russians.
Even as his arrival raised hopes on the thorny Polish question, the world learned that Russia had just signed a 20-year pact of friendship with Poland's Warsaw government.
This Polish government had no pro-Western members. They were all pro-Soviet. The Western leaders were angry and upset. Molotov saw Truman and his Secretary of State, Stettinius, Alger Hiss's boss.
By that time, the Polish situation had, to use a gentle word, crystallized. The Russians were moving forward. They seemed to be paying no attention to the kind of provisional government that the British and Americans had hoped for. And therefore, protests, angry protests, were going to the Russians about that. And Truman decided to have a showdown at which he was gifted. On that occasion, as you know from what is now part of the history books, he accused Molotov, in effect, of violation of the agreements as early as that. This is a strange thing to do in the midst of a war, by no means yet won, with an important ally, but he did it. And it ended by Molotov saying, "I've never been talked to like this in my life," and Truman saying, "Well, if you keep your agreements, you won't be talked to like that," just like a school teacher. Stettinius, who'd been present, told me the next morning that he was still shaken. So he said, "I thought the whole conference was off."
Well, that was an unfortunate conversation. It was one of the first diplomatic conversations that Truman had. And I can only say that it was not a diplomatic statement on Truman's part. He used good, solid Missouri language, which was very definite. And Molotov had talked to other people that way, but had had no one talk to him that way. So that he was very much upset. And I think I gained the impression that he thought this was a new voice, not Roosevelt anymore, but a more aggressive president.
When he was sworn in 2 weeks earlier, Truman had said he would continue Roosevelt's policies, but his sudden harshness with Molotov now worried the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. The day after the confrontation, Stimson told Truman about something he thought could transform America's dealings with Russia. Stimson's biographer, McGeorge Bundy.
Stimson wrote to Truman, "I think it is very important that I should have a talk with you as soon as possible on a highly secret matter. I mentioned it to you shortly after you took office, but have not urged it since on account of the pressure you've been under. It, however, has such a bearing on our present foreign relations and has such an important effect upon all my thinking in this field that I think you ought to know about it without much further delay." The next day, April 25th, Stimson explained to Truman that his view of foreign policy, Stimson's, was dominated by the imminent prospect of atomic power, and the terms which might be got from Russia in exchange for sharing atomic secrets.
It was Truman's first detailed news of the atomic bomb and its diplomatic potential. He asked Stimson to head a committee to decide its military use. By this time, in great secrecy, two kinds of atomic bomb had been developed. One based on uranium, the other on a man-made element, plutonium. The uranium bomb did not need testing, but there was only one. The plutonium bombs, easier to produce in quantity, would have to be tested before use. The first would be ready by July. A special unit of the American Air Force had begun practicing the tactics involved in dropping one very large bomb with great accuracy and then getting away as fast as possible. Its commander was Colonel Paul Tibbets.
Up to this point, anything in the way of an error in bombing up to 500 or 600 feet was considered good bombing. So I told him then, if you have a 100-foot error from 25,000 feet, you're just a borderline case. I want it less than 100. I was told immediately, you can't do this. And so I said, I don't know why not. And they said, well, nobody's ever done it. But I said, that's no reason why it can't be done. I said, practice, they tell me, makes perfect. So I said, we'll practice, and you'll practice until you do it.
From their forward bases in the Mariana Islands, American B-29 bombers were already attacking Japan's cities with more conventional weapons. To begin with, the results were poor. General Curtis LeMay developed a new tactic, low-level incendiary raids.
With aerial photography, you could outline a general area, but not precisely. You just couldn't avoid doing collateral damage, and I'm sure we burned down a lot of Japanese buildings that had nothing to do with the war industry at all. This, of course, is one of the sad things of war that can't be helped.
On March the 9th, 1945, 2,000 tons of incendiaries were dropped on Tokyo, destroying 16 square miles of the city. 80,000 civilians died, more that night in Tokyo than in the whole of England in the Blitz. Most suffocated in the firestorm. LeMay now attacked city after city. It looked as if the B-29s alone might defeat Japan.
It wasn't until General Arnold asked a direct question, how long is the war going to last? And then we sat down and did some thinking about it, and it indicated that we would be pretty much out of targets around the 1st of September. And with the targets gone, we couldn't see much of any war going on at the time.
By the spring of 1945, Japan was helpless in the face of American air and naval power. Most of the Japanese merchant fleet and navy had been sunk. An effective blockade had cut off Japan from her overseas armies, grounded most of her air force for lack of fuel, and threatened her population with starvation. American fighter bombers roamed at will, backing up the devastating fire raids. Many Japanese politicians realized that their country could not hold out much longer. April the 1st, American troops land on Japanese soil, Okinawa, only 350 miles from the mainland. They face fierce resistance. But as the battle starts, the growing peace party in Japan secure the appointment of a new cabinet led by Admiral Suzuki.
When Suzuki cabinet came into existence, the military situation was deplorable. Moreover, the economic plight of our nation was quite apparent. The military command tried to squeeze the last drop so to speak, of nation's blood in order to prosecute further the useless war. But it became evident to any sensible man that we were at the end of tether.
軍の若いところはいわゆる玉砕って言いますか
The younger officers in the army, the extremists, thought that we should fight to the bitter end until every man had been killed. But the war minister, General Anami, didn't agree. He thought that if we fought on till the Americans invaded the mainland and then hit their forces hard on the beaches once, we could then negotiate peace on terms more favorable to Japan.
有利な話ができるだろうと、こういう意見でした。
But Truman would not negotiate. He told Congress so in May after Germany's defeat.
Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender. I want the entire world to know that this direction must and will remain unchanged and unhampered.
Truman now faced two major problems: how to deal with the Russians in Europe and whether to ask them to fulfill their pledge to join the war against Japan. In Germany, Russian and Western troops exchanged toasts. But already Churchill was sending urgent messages to Truman, warning that an Iron Curtain was being drawn down in Europe by Russia. The big three must meet quickly before, as he put it, the armies of democracy melted. And Truman had a new Secretary of State, James Burns. Burns wanted to finish the war against Japan before the Russians could join in and cause problems for the West in Asia, too.
It was ever present in my mind that it was important that we should have an end to the war before the Russians came in.
But Stimson wanted to avoid hasty decisions in Europe or the Far East before the bomb was ready. He wrote to Truman.
Over any such tangled weave of problems, the atomic secret would be dominant. It seems a terrible thing to gamble with such big stakes in diplomacy without having your MasterCard in your hand. Truman reassured Stimson. The Big Three meeting was postponed until the 15th of July on purpose to give us more time.
Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's close friend whom Stalin trusted, was sent to Moscow at the end of May to take the heat temporarily out of the Polish issue. He reported back that he had smoothed things over. Stalin had also promised, unprompted, to join the war against Japan on August the 8th. While Hopkins was in Moscow, Stimson's committee reached its decision.
The committee studying the atomic bomb unanimously recommended that it be used as soon as possible, without warning, against a major Japanese military establishment. Only this, Stimson thought, would provide the psychological blow which might induce Japan to surrender. Although he agreed with some of Truman's advisors that the Japanese should be given an ultimatum which made it clear that they could keep the emperor, he opposed announcing this until after the bomb had at least been tested. But after the war, he wrote, it is possible, in the light of the final surrender, that a clearer and earlier exposition of American willingness to retain the emperor could have produced an earlier ending of the war.
June the 18th, Washington. General Eisenhower is given a hero's welcome after his victory in Europe. In the White House that day, Truman is asked to approve his Joint Chiefs of Staff's plans to invade Japan in November.
We gathered up our papers and started to go out, and Mr. Truman spotted me, and he said, Mr. McCloy, nobody gets out of this room without voting, without expressing himself. Everybody else has. Do you think I have any other alternative? I looked over at Colonel Stimson. He always liked to be called colonel. He'd been a colonel of a regiment in World War I, rather than secretary. I looked over at Stimson, And he nodded his head and said, go ahead. So I started in, and I said that I thought that we ought to have our heads examined if we didn't at this point begin to think in terms of a political culmination of the war rather than a military culmination. And I said I'd give them some terms. I'd send a message over to them. I'd spell out the terms, just what they were. And I remember trying to, when Mr. Truman said, well, what are your terms? What would you do? I hadn't quite prepared for the actual dictation of the surrender terms at that point, but I started in. And I said, in the first place, I'd say you can have the Mikado, but he's got to be a constitutional monarch. You've got to have a representative form of government from here on. You can have access to, but not control over over raw materials so that you can have a viable economy. And I spelled it out as best I could. And I'd say, besides that, we've got a new force. And it's in the force of a new type of energy that will revolutionize warfare, destructive beyond any contemplation. I'd mentioned the bomb. Well, mentioning the bomb, even that late date in that select group was like, they were all shocked because this was such a closely guarded secret. It was comparable to mentioning skull and bones at Yale, which you're not supposed to do. But Mr. Truman said, this is just the sort of thing I was trying to reach for. Get that all spelled out. At that point, Stimson did come in and join and support my position. But then later on, Mr. Burns, who was then Secretary of State, who was not present, vetoed the idea of offering them the Mikado. One can only speculate as to whether it would have happened if we had put the message to the Japanese government, the form that I indicated, including the Mikado. I've always had the feeling, in view of some of the information that we've had since, of the tendency on the part of some of the real military hotheads in Japan to think that this was perhaps the best way out, that we might have been able to avoid the dropping of the bomb.
By this time, the battle for Okinawa is almost over. 12,000 Americans had died, a bloody foretaste of what invasion of the mainland might cost. For the Japanese, the lesson was harsher still. 100,000 died. And for the first time in the war, their soldiers surrendered in thousands. As the last resistance ended on June the 22nd, the new Japanese cabinet made its first move towards peace.
Ultimately, we had to conduct the negotiations with our military opponents, that is to say, America and Britain. But the High Command refused categorically to entertain any idea of starting conversation with the enemy powers. The only great power left out of the enemy camp was the Soviet Union, because of the fact that nominally there existed still the neutrality pact. And so this was the only window open for peace endeavors. And this window looked toward the north. And so we argued it out with the military command. And the military command finally, reluctantly, acceded to our request that we start negotiations with the Soviet Union in order to arrive at the final destination, which was Washington and London.
But it was the Chinese foreign minister, not the Japanese, that Stalin had been meeting. A huge Japanese army still occupied parts of China, including Manchuria. The Russians and Chinese were negotiating terms under which Stalin would attack that army. When Truman sailed to Europe on July the 7th for his meeting with Stalin and Churchill, he knew, through intercepted messages, that Japan wanted an end to the war, but not unconditional surrender. Truman and Burns now had several options open to them. They could modify the surrendered terms. They could encourage the Russians to invade Manchuria. They could demonstrate the atomic bomb. They could invade Japan itself. But Truman decided that he would drop atomic bombs on Japan without warning. This alone, he hoped, would end the Pacific War quickly before the Russians joined in. And it would immensely strengthen American bargaining power in Europe. The decision had already been taken when Truman arrived for the Big Three meeting on July the 15th. The next morning, just before dawn, at a remote desert site in New Mexico, Robert Oppenheimer and the team that had designed and built the bomb witnessed the first atomic explosion.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
The plutonium bomb exploded with a force of 20,000 tons of TNT. The desert, at the point of the explosion, was turned into glass. By July 1945, Japan's economy was crumbling and her cities were defenseless against the B-29 raids. Although her army remained virtually intact, Japan's war industries were smashed. 1 million civilians had died. Millions more were homeless. The U.S. Air Force had no doubts that surrender was only weeks away.
It was a hopeless situation for them, and the B-29s were flying over Japan at will, and they couldn't do anything about it. We could destroy any target at will without much opposition. So with this hopeless situation facing, that they just didn't have the will to continue. As a matter of fact, they'd been trying to get out of the war for about 3 months before they actually did, and that they had asked the Russians to be an intermediary to try to negotiate them out of the war, and the Russians had been stalling till they got the European War finished so they could get into the Pacific War before it ended.
Stalin and Molotov refused to see the Japanese ambassador before they left Moscow for the last Big Three meeting for 10 years. Also at Potsdam was Secretary of War Stimson. He passed on detailed news of the atomic test to Truman and Burns, who, he noted in his diary, were immensely pleased.
The president was tremendously pepped up by it and spoke to me of it again and again when I saw him. He said it gave him an entirely new feeling of confidence. And when Stimson told Churchill about the successful test the next day, Churchill said he now understood how this pepping up of Truman had taken place, and that he felt the same way.
The British and Americans now debated whether to tell the Russians about the bomb. Some argued that its full weight as a diplomatic lever would only become evident after it had been dropped on Japan.
After one of our meetings, just as we adjourned, Truman went up with his interpreter to Stalin and told him briefly what we had discovered and what the effect of the atomic bomb would be. And all Stalin did was to nod his head and say thank you quite curtly. His expression changed in no way, and that was all there was to it.
When it was a tremendous disappointment, we thought he would be flabbergasted at this thing, but he just passed it off as an incident. Whether he knew about it, whether he didn't want to show any great emotion in regard to it, I don't know. All I know is that he took it very much in his stride, and somewhat to our disappointment went on to the next item in the agenda. And this rather dismayed Stimson, because he thought that once having disclosed this, there would be immediately a great Russian rush on the part of the Soviets to sit down and talk to us about what the future implications of this thing and what the future uses of it would be, but he got no encouragement at all.
Stimson's tactics had misfired. The Big Three had met before the full power of the atomic weapon was revealed, and Stimson feared that from now on Secretary of State Burns would use the bomb to try to lever direct concessions from the Russians.
I rather think that Mr. Burns had something of the thought that this would be a sort of a point of leverage in diplomatic exchanges, whereas I think Mr. Stimson, or Colonel Stimson, had a different idea of the use of the bomb.
He wrote to the President to urge direct negotiation on the nuclear issue and argued that relations with Russia may perhaps be irretrievably embittered by the way in which we approach the solution of the bomb with Russia. For if we fail to approach them now and merely negotiate with them, having this weapon rather ostentatiously on our hip, their suspicions and their distrust of our purposes and motives will increase.
With the atomic weapons now almost ready for use, it was time for Truman to issue a final ultimatum to the Japanese, and again, Stimson's advice was rejected. Truman and Burns decided not to modify the unconditional surrender formula by offering the Japanese the chance to keep their emperor.
My hope is that the people of Japan will now realize that further resistance to the forces of the nation, now united in the enforcement of law and justice, will be absolutely futile. There is still time, but little time, for the Japanese to save themselves from the destruction which threatens them.
The very purpose of it was to assure them that they would have the decision, and at the same time not start a controversy among ourselves about the position of the emperor.
When the Potsdam Proclamation was issued, Foreign Minister Togo and I worked together many sleepless nights, and I took this proclamation to the attention of the foreign minister and explained the substance of it. Togo at once said that this was acceptable, and he immediately went to the palace and asked for an audience. The emperor approved Togo's judgment that this should be accepted and the war be terminated at once.
Foreign Minister Togo said in the cabinet meeting that we can stop the war without the question of the emperor. We can keep the emperor right. But at that time, we, Japanese government, asked some intermediate mediation to the Russia. So many cabinet ministers said, well, let us see the situation for a while.
Prime Minister Suzuki announced that Japan would ignore the ultimatum. Perhaps Russia would save Japan's honor. After all, the Potsdam Declaration had not been signed by Stalin. He might still mediate. Stalin told Truman about the Japanese approaches. Truman knew all about them. The Japanese codes had been broken. Both leaders agreed to ignore the peace feelers, and Truman sailed home on August the 3rd. With no response from the Japanese, he authorized the Air Force to drop the atom bomb as soon as they were ready. The Japanese Foreign Minister Togo, in desperation, cabled his ambassador in Moscow, "Since the loss of one day relative to this present matter may result in 1,000 years of regret, it is requested you immediately have a talk with Molotov." But Molotov would still not meet the ambassador. On August the 6th, 2 days before the Russians had said they would attack the Japanese, the Enola Gay set off on its 1,500-mile journey.
I noticed when I taxied out that there were several hundred people that were in the area that the aircraft were parked in. There were some in front of the control tower, and people were out there standing to look and see what was going on without really knowing what they were looking at. But it was something different, so they wanted to be part of it. They wanted to see what was taking place.
Now there's one bomb, and one airplane is going to carry that bomb, and that's the group commander. That's then Colonel Tibbets with his full crew. My crew was assigned to fly in formation on his right wing during the bombing for a couple of reasons. Somebody had to fly there, and I was scheduled by him to fly the second mission if there were to be a second mission. We would have a third aircraft flying on the left wing who would drop back just before the bombing. He was equipped with cameras. We would fly unseen by each other for the first 3 hours, and to make rendezvous at 8,000 feet over Iwo Jima at 6 a.m. This was the plan.
We made the rendezvous quite successfully, and then we had about an hour and a half or a little over that to go along in a lazy formation on a beautiful night out over the Pacific with moons and cloud puffs that looked like powder puffs. It was a quiet, peaceful evening, believe me. And nothing much went on. A little bit of talk in the airplane, but that's always normal on a mission. But then you get a quiet period, and while we were going along there, I guess everybody was dreaming or something because it was quiet.
At 8:15, on the morning of August the 6th, the Enola Gay, flying at 32,000 feet, released its bomb over Hiroshima.
As soon as the weight had left the airplane, I immediately went into this steep turn, as did Sweeney and Marquardt behind me, and we tried then to place distance between ourselves and the point of impact. In this particular case, that bomb had 53 seconds from the time it left the airplane until it exploded. That's how long it took it to fall from the bombing altitude, 53 seconds. And this gave us adequate time, of course, to make the turn. Now, we had just made the turn and rolled out in level flight when it seemed like somebody had grabbed a hold of my airplane and gave it a real hard shaking, because this was the shock wave. It had come up. This was something that I was glad to feel, because it gave me a moment of relief after all, having worked on that bomb for well over a year. You know, that 53 seconds time while I'm turning the airplane, I'm wondering, is it or is it not going to work? And of course, the shock wave hitting us was indication it had worked. Therefore, I felt that success had been achieved.
When the bomb came, I saw the yellowish flash, and I was buried in the darkness. The two-storied wooden building that was my house with 8 rooms in it was blown down to pieces and covered me up.
When I regained consciousness, everything was pitch dark all around me. I tried to stand up, but my leg was broken. I tried to speak, and I found that 6 of my teeth had been broken. Then I realized that my face was burnt and my back was burnt. There was a slash right across from one shoulder down to the waist. I crawled to the riverbank, and when I got there, I saw hundreds of bodies come floating down the river. And it was then that I realized, with a shock, that all Hiroshima had been hit.
The day was clear when we dropped that bomb. It was a clear, sunshiny day, and visibility was unrestricted. So as we came back around, again facing the direction of Hiroshima, where we saw this cloud coming up. The cloud by this time, now 2 minutes, cloud was up at our altitude. We were 33,000 feet at this time, and the cloud was up there and continuing to go right on up in a boiling fashion. It was rolling and boiling. The surface was nothing but a black boiling, only thing I could say, like a barrel of tar. Probably the best description that I can give. This is exactly the way it looked down there. Where before there had been a city, distinctive houses, buildings, and everything that you could see from our altitude. Now you couldn't see anything except this black boiling debris down below. We took pictures as rapidly as we could. My immediate concern after that was, it's time to get out of here.
I encounter a long and ceaseless lines of escapees. All of them had no cloth whatsoever on their bodies. And the skin from their faces, arms, and breast peeling off and hanging loose, and yet without any expression. In deep silence, they are escaping. I thought it was a procession of ghosts.
The words went back basically to the effect that the bombing conditions were clear, the target had been hit, the results were better than had been anticipated, and that message was sent on back. From there on, it was just a proposition of letting everybody talk for a few minutes and get it all out of their system. The excitement was over. Pretty soon it became a rather routine flight back home. As a matter of fact, it was routine enough that I let Bob Lewis and the autopilot fly that airplane. I went back and got some sleep for about the first time in 30 hours. And I was ready for it.
The long, drawn-out war, you begin to get casualties from the side effects of exhaustion, privation, disease, and things of that sort. So getting it over with as quick as possible is a moral responsibility of everyone concerned. Now, it's true that we knew the war was over, and if we just waited a little while, it would be over because the Japanese were negotiating, and we knew this by the fact that we'd broken our code and were listening to the communications. But I believe that President Truman made the proper decision to use it, because it probably hastened the negotiations, and even if we just saved one day, to me, it would be worthwhile. You have to do it.
I thought it was absolutely unnecessary because by the time the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, we were conducting negotiations with the Soviet government, looking toward an early end of hostilities. And we were completely exhausted. And the Navy and the Army, too, were slowly becoming more amenable to the idea of peace.
An appalling subject to talk about, and the United States has consciously and unconsciously a great deal of guilt complex about its use. But Truman made the decision on the basis of the military necessities, and I think an impartial analysis, particularly from the Japanese themselves, more evidence is coming out that they would have fought on fanatically. You know, they did fight on fanatically in some of the islands, even in spite of the surrender. And the emperor wouldn't have had the courage to have called it off, or wouldn't have had the support to call it off.
When I heard about the atomic bomb, I was so astonished. And I frankly say the American people is brutality. I wondered if American people are really civilized. But at the same time, I thought this maybe become a key for Japan to end the war.
It was 2 days before the Japanese government realized what the atomic bomb was and what it had done. 70,000 had died in Hiroshima. Another 70,000 were injured. 97% of the city's buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. President Truman, on hearing the news, called it the greatest thing in history. The peace group in the Japanese cabinet hoped that the bomb might persuade the war faction to accept surrender. As the cabinet met on the morning of August the 9th, it received further shattering news. The previous evening in Moscow, Molotov had finally received the Japanese ambassador and bluntly told him that Russia was about to declare war on Japan. 8 hours later, exactly 3 months after the defeat of Germany, just as Stalin had promised, Russia attacked the Japanese army in Manchuria. Japanese hopes of Russian mediation were at an end. American hopes of finishing the war before Russia became involved were thwarted. Later that same morning, the Americans dropped a plutonium bomb on Nagasaki. It killed 60,000 people. But even now, the Japanese militants held out for a surrender without an occupation. The Peace Party wanted only to preserve the emperor's position. For the first time, to break the deadlock, the Emperor Hirohito was called in to decide. He chose peace.
I shall never forget the emotion of that time. Everybody started to cry. So I looked at the emperor's face. He just kept silent, but he wear white glove on his hands. He wiped his own face several times. So we had, we could know that his emperor himself, His Majesty the Emperor himself, crying. I shall never forget this emotion in this room at that time.
On August the 10th, the Japanese made it known they would surrender if the emperor were allowed to stay. On August the 12th, the Allies sent a non-committal reply. By this time, Japan's army was near revolt.
Even if 1,000 atom bombs had been dropped, and even if Japan had been completely devastated, you must remember that Japan's honor was at stake. The pride of the Japanese at that time, who felt that the only honorable way out of the war was not to surrender, but to die to the last man.
The Americans dropped leaflets urging the Japanese to surrender. These almost upset the delicate maneuverings of the Peace Party.
That could have caused a lot of trouble. Civilians and soldiers all over the country were completely unaware of what was going on. If they had found out that the government was actually negotiating peace with the United States, the situation would have become impossible. It might even have led to a revolution. So I felt we had to reach a final decision as fast as possible.
Once again, on August the 14th, the Emperor met a divided Supreme War Council and told them they must accept the Allied ultimatum. He himself would broadcast the next day. That night, a group of junior officers invaded the palace and tried to seize the recording of the Emperor's message. They couldn't find it. The coup failed. At noon on August the 15th, the Japanese people heard their Emperor's voice for the first time. The war, he told them, has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Moreover, the enemy has begun to use a new and most cruel bomb. Should we continue to fight, it will not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also the total destruction of human civilization. We must, therefore, endure the unendurable.
When the emperor addressed the nation at large through his broadcast, I know that 99 men out of 100 were taken aback. They expected the emperor to urge them to fight on. So the shock was tremendous. And those army officers, particularly the younger ones, who said that they had to fight to the bitter end, were naturally disillusioned. Some even tried to remonstrate with the decision taken by the cabinet for surrender.
ある意味から言うと、ソ連が参戦しましたね。
In a way, it could be said that the atomic bombings and Russia's sudden attack on Japan helped to bring about the end of the war. If those events had not happened, Japan at that stage probably could not have stopped fighting.
まだ戦はやめられなかったでしょう。陸軍が強いですから。
The war had ended, but not the dying. And radiation sickness, which the Americans had not foreseen, would kill thousands more in the years to come. The morning of September the 2nd, 1945, the United States battleship Missouri is anchored in Tokyo Bay. The new Japanese Foreign Minister, Shigemitsu, limps on board to sign the surrender document. The Allied commander, General MacArthur.
I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
The Foreign Minister's aide, Kase, watched the ceremony.
I saw many thousands of sailors everywhere on this huge vessel, and just in front of us were delegates of the victorious powers in military uniforms glittering with gold. And looking at them, I wondered how Japan ever thought she could defeat all those nations.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.